Hello, everyone. Greetings, wherever you are today. Welcome to the GSMA 5G Spectrum Needs Vision for 2030 webinar. My name is Luciana Camargos, and I will start talking a bit about our vision, our plans, and what we have done so far about this topic that is so important to us. So why are we here? We have been asking ourselves how much spectrum 5G would need by 2030 in different scenarios, in different circumstances, in low, mid, and high band. So for the past 18 months, we have been working on that in the GSMA, and we released the report about 12 months ago. And we're now releasing 2 further reports. And with that, we would like to cover how much spectrum operators would need to provide 5G in 2030, or by 2030, I should say. So we're starting with the economic power of 5G. Today is about discussing how to get to the most out of 5G. What tools we need to ensure that speeds are maximized while rollout is delivered cost effectively. The economic value that you see on the screen, and by the way, that's a report we released back in February. It shows how much the 5G can impact the global economy in 2030, and that value, as you can see, is $961 billion. This economic value will depend basically on ensuring as many people have access to the fastest 5G as possible. So we can build 5G to have phenomenal economic impact in a time of growing financial uncertainty. But if we don't empower 5G with the right spectrum, 40% of its opportunity will be lost. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see how much is lost. It's around 40%. And that happens if we don't make available enough spectrum. So there is one thing as saying what 5G will look like and what 5G will deliver and what are the capabilities of 5G. But if we don't empower the operators to actually be able to perform as it was expected, the socioeconomic benefits won't be the same. And that means up to 40% loss. As I said, we're going to be discussing low bands, mid bands, and high bands. It's important to understand the needs of all three of them. For high band and mid band, it's possible to analyze and calculate the megahertz value needed. But for low band, it's simply that sub 1 gigahertz capacity supply always outstrip the mobile spectrum needs. There isn't enough sub 1 gigahertz spectrum as much as the operators would benefit from providing 5G type services. So low band already punches above its weight. We see in the report we're launching that between 10 and 20% of traffic goes through low band, although the share of capacity is just a fraction of that. Expanding low band will bring crucial policy benefits. The most important of all, low bands will bring in building digital equality and through it, digital inclusion. And that is at the heart of the GSMA values. Going deep a bit on the report that we have, the low band has a direct impact on the download speeds in areas, and by that, of course, rural areas that rely mostly on it. The current assignments vary, and there are differences in Region 1 and Region 2 and Region 3, but nearly all cases there is under 100 megahertz of downlink spectrum. So if we add 600 megahertz to it, there's a strong capacity increase, and with it there will be a direct boost of downlink speeds, generally between 35 and 50%. It does depend on the band plans that are available. It does depend on available currently and which band plan it will be chosen for that. But there is no question that most advanced 5G markets are adding mid-band spectrum. We all hear about mid-band spectrum every day. But to manage digital equality between urban and rural, communities served by low band must be allowed to keep up. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see that moving on to mid-bands and the report that we launched last year, mid-band is the range that is perhaps studied more than any other. We're all talking about mid-band at the moment. Most auctions, most licensing is happening in mid-bands. And this is the engine which drives citywide 5G. Because of that, it's the range which drives the most economic benefit. So if we go back to the socioeconomic benefit I showed earlier, around 65% of those $961 billion that we said would go to the GDP impact in 2030, around 65% comes from mid-band. So how much is needed? And that was the first report we did. The answer is 2 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum, which we say between 1 and 7 gigahertz is required for 5G on average per country by 2030. So when we studied this range, there were 37 cities that we studied, and most of them came close to this average. And it didn't matter if it was lower income countries, mid income countries, or high income countries, they all came close to this average. There are some outlying cities. So for example, if we have very dense populations with low fiber connectivity, for example, they will need more than 2 gigahertz. And you can look at that in the report, the links there, and it's very interesting, the results and what come out of it. Importantly, so before the GSMA talked about this report and talked about the importance of these 2 gigahertz, we saw already that the earliest adopting markets had already started to move close to that figure in their roadmap plans, and in some cases in their licensing. The regulators are seeing this need in their local markets, and they're acting on it. And again, if we look back to how much spectrum it was calculated, not by us, but by the ITU in 2015, how much spectrum would be needed, not by 5G, but 4G advanced by 2020, the ITU had calculated between 1340 and 1960 megahertz. That's not very far off from the 2 gigahertz we're talking about now, even though we're talking about on a 5G environment. So we see there is a need, it is growing, and it's important that we address that. Next slide talks about how we get there. How are we going to get those 2 gigahertz, which are so important to guarantee the mid-band and the services to all consumers and citizens? At the end of the day, we're agnostic how we get to 2 gigahertz. At the bottom of the screen, you can see all bands that are considered for 5G use, that are considered for IMT use, and all bands that could potentially be upgraded, could potentially be implemented for 5G. Those are the options on the screen. But as you can see, if you do the maths, you see that one thing becomes clear. It is very challenging to get to 2 gigahertz of mid-band without support of the 6 gigahertz range. This is why you hear about the 6 gigahertz range so much from the mobile industry. Getting that band assigned and supporting IMT at WRC23 is an important asset to keep for mobile. So we see that operators will need this to produce 5G quality, to ensure that the limits of densification are not surpassed. Densification is not forever. You cannot do that indefinitely. And operators need this to ensure that 5G is available for all consumers. So we do urge regulators to listen to us on 6 gigahertz, to realize its value for 5G, and as such, its value as an economic development tool. We move on to millimeter wave. The report we release is about how much of millimeter wave is needed. We spent the last cycle until 2019 looking into millimeter wave and identifying millimeter wave for IMT, for 5G, but how much is needed? What we saw is that releasing this report today, we looked at the core use cases of EMBB, FWA, and enterprise networks. The sum 5 gigahertz is needed on average for capacity on these applications. So going into a bit more detail about that in the following slide. Of course, there is a lot of variation. Firstly, the EMBB use will vary in time scale between early adopters and other countries. This will mean that there will be variation in the MBB needed by 2030. The early adopter markets will have an earlier need in this case. But what we see is that all countries will eventually grow to around 4.5 gigahertz figure as we stretch into the 2030s. At the same time, as we see the FWA on the right-hand side of the slide, FWA is governed by the area, with the suburbs carrying the strongest need as city centers become connected to FTTP. There are examples where millimeter wave has been used for the majority of 5G capacity, but more often we expect this will come as a capacity layer above mid-band and low-band. Moving on to my last slide, I'll leave you with that thought that 5G can deliver economic growth, social development, and industrial agility, but will require timely access to spectrum and low, mid, and high bands. And with that, I would like to move on and give the floor to my colleague Luiz, who will take you over with the panel.
Thank you very much, Luciana. Thank you for the amazing presentation that will kind of now create this nice debate within the panel that I'm very honored to have so many amazing panelists here today with us. Dr. Mercedes Aramendía is president of URSEC Uruguay. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll also like to invite Eric Fournier, that is Director for Spectrum Planning and International Affairs at ANFR in France. Thank you very much, Eric, for being with us today. Please join us as well, James Cameron, authority member of ACMA Australia. James is part of the board and deals directly with Spectrum, so that's what he leads in the in ACMA. Thank you very much, James. I'd like to invite now from the operators, I would like to invite Ana Carolina Pedreira, Senior Technology Partnership Manager in Team Brazil, and Daudeline from Verizon, Vice President and Associate General Counsel, Federal Regulatory and Legal Affairs. To understand from your side, how does Uruguay see spectrum as the pillar of economic growth? And how do you connect that to the development of affordability and closing the digital divide?
Thank you, Luis, for the question. I'm very happy of being part of this panel, and thank you for the invitation. Unquestionably, the spectrum is a pillar of economic and social development, an essential resource of a strategic nature, so the proper administration and management of the radio spectrum impose the need to strike a balance between the multiple and diverse services and uses that require it, looking for coordination and efficiency. Emerging technologies are rapidly transforming daily life, and spectrum regulators must respond promptly and appropriately to these new realities, working with the entire ecosystem. The mobile broadband internet coverage in Uruguay shows that the percent of 4G network coverage in the south of the country is almost 96%, while in the north of the country it is around 90.4%. But this coverage refers to radio coverage, not to the user experience. Efforts should focus on reducing the country's digital divide, ensuring that network development is sustained and sustainable. We are determined and working hard to provide all the citizens of Uruguay have the same service conditions, and this imposes the need to take actions aimed and jointly demanding and facilitating service providers to achieve better performance. And in this context, the 5G seems to be an opportunity to boost in inclusion and innovation. Two elements that we consider essential for operators when deploying telecommunication network and services are, firstly, the freedom to decide when and where to install base stations. Even so, now we are working on mapping the country to cover the entire territory to identify those areas where the experience is not desired. And secondly, technological neutrality, which implies that as long as the operator is authorized to provide IMT services, it is the operator who decides when, where, and how to deploy the technology, 4G and or 5G. It's crucial to promote and encourage the deployment of telecommunication network elements and infrastructure sharing in the national territory, involving all stakeholders to facilitate universal access to telecommunication services. In this scenario, the synergy between the policymaker, the regulator, the service providers, and the municipal authorities is essential, each playing its role. Also, in the Uruguay Digital Agenda 2025, the government established the strategic priorities for sustainable development and the promotion of a digital society that leaves no one behind, promoting the inclusion of digital technologies in all sectors of public affairs and always putting the person at the center of everything. Specific goals in this agenda are included, but I want to remark, for example, to incorporate the Internet of Things in the provision and management of public services, improve the country connectivity of mobile services, improve the quality of services, enhance the development of digital competencies and skills in all people, develop a digital strategy for older adults, and also to design a digital inclusion strategy for the rural population, emphasizing rural women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the great start, because you were able to summarize and bring the debate so we can go a little bit deeper on a specific spectrum that could be very helpful for that differences that you mentioned, as well as it was important to see the other things such as tech neutrality that is very important to develop this in time. So, and having that in mind, I will move then to Eric and ask about specifically, we talked about inclusivity and we also talk about affordability. What is for you the role of low bands whenever it comes to this conversation that we started just now with Mercedes?
Thank you, Luis. Obviously, the low bands are essential for the mobile coverage. That's what is enabling the coverage of rural areas with all technologies from 2G to 5G. That's also important for building penetration in urban areas, and I think that is recognized by everybody. Now, behind your question, there's another question, which is whether there's a possibility to expand lower bands, obviously. That was in the slides from Luciana. We have in Europe for the time being 2 times 95 megahertz of spectrum. Below 1 gigahertz, and there's these questions about potential 600 megahertz in the medium long term, and something like the 600 megahertz frequency band, which could be made available in Europe. If this frequency band would be available, I think it's very clear that mobile operators will take high benefit and society will take benefit of this use for sure. So the real issue for us, in particular in preparation of WRC 23, is that broadcasting TV is the incumbent user in this frequency band. It has also bringing a lot of social benefit. In France, the use of this broadcasting TV is something like 20% of the population of households relying only on terrestrial TV to get access to TV, to linear TV, and something like 50% of the populations having use of terrestrial TV, mainly for secondary TV set. So for the time being, it's very clear that it is something which is a spectrum which is not available for something like the 600 megahertz. It's extremely difficult to predict what could be the situation in the future, in particular after 2031, where in Europe we will have to change the current harmonized regulatory framework. But that's something we have some difficulty to predict. We don't know exactly what will be the evolution of the need of TV, whether there will be evolutions in terms of the quality of the platform, TV platform, whether they will introduce ultra high definition, for example, in CTV platform. So there's a lot of questions, which is in fact making me in difficult situations or positions when I would have to respond to your underlying questions, whether there would be a possibility one day to have the 600 megahertz frequency band being made available to mobile operators in Europe or in France.
Thank you very much, Eric. But that's very encouraging. We see the importance of that part of the band, as well as the possibility of studying how to move forward. So that's very encouraging to hear as well. And then I'll move to an operator to see how low bands have been playing a role, not just in rural areas, because we talk a lot about that, but also in other parts, especially in urbanized areas as well. So, Carol, can you answer that question for us?
Of course, first of all, on behalf of Team Brazil, I would like to thank the GSMA and you, Luiz, for being invited to participate in this very relevant debate on spectrum needs, which, as we all know, is one of the most important assets for the mobile networks. Low bands have several advantages and play an important role also in urban areas. Firstly, the use of low bands allows reducing network costs because I don't need to put so many base stations in, which translates into a lower cost of service, of course. If we also consider the inherent characteristics of signal propagation in low bands, this spectrum allows a better coverage experience and serve availability for the end customer. Team Brazil is the Brazilian operator with the widest coverage in the 700 megahertz band in more than 4,000 cities in Brazil, which corresponds to 94% of the urban population covered by this band, the 700 megahertz, and has been constantly indicated as the operator with the most available network. Also, the low bands, when combined with medium and high bands through techniques such as carrier aggregation, allow a greater range
of those bands that have characteristics of greater capacity. So I don't know if you question me about, is there enough low band capacity? Because no, there is not enough capacity in the low bands, especially because of legacy services. Eric talked about the TV broadcast services that here in Brazil, I think worldwide, are falling into disuse over the years, but we don't know when we could use this spectrum, for example, the 600 megahertz UHF bands for IMT, but it is important that regulators continue to think about ways to enable such bands for mobile services in a smooth transition of spectrum, of course, through spectrum sharing, white spaces, for example, until it is possible to completely reform, for example, these bands for mobile services. I think that's it.
That makes total sense and complements the conversation, of course. I would like to, having that in mind, and that the need of the availability of spectrum and how to plan ahead, I'd like to ask James about, so we all know that Australia has a commendable process for roadmaps, but how would you consider that process? How would you talk about the importance of that process? And how do you see the differences that it has made throughout the time for Australia to be where Australia is at the moment?
Thank you very much, Luiz. And can I thank you also for having me on the panel? It's already been a very interesting discussion. I look forward to the rest of it. But we've already heard that a defining characteristic of spectrum management is that we are dealing with sectors and technologies that are rapidly changing, leading to increasing demands for spectrum and more often than not competing priorities. So like all spectrum regulators, our purpose is to maximise the long-term public interest from the allocation and use of spectrum. And we seek to deliver on this throughout all of our work, but most specifically in setting our work program and in progressing the major band planning and allocation processes that we undertake within that program. In Australia, we publish annually a 5-year spectrum outlook. This is the document that provides a scan over the horizon through the medium term of the technological, market and policy factors which set the environment that shape our work, and a more detailed work program for the coming year. Importantly, we consult on this document, and thus it's not only a key to our being transparent about our plans, but it's also a critical focal point for our stakeholders to inform us of their priorities and the perspectives they have on what should drive our work. It's become a vital evidence and information gathering mechanism for what we use as an organisation. And then at the level of specific band planning and allocation projects, we work through a structured set of stages to consider when and how to optimise arrangements in the public interest. For us, the clarity of structure of our planning process, from monitoring bands that have the potential to warrant a change of use, through the preliminary investigation of options, replanning decision making, and then ultimately implementation and allocation processes, are important for a number of reasons. They enable all interested parties to participate at each stage of what are often complex and difficult decision processes. And when we can draw upon the expertise and information basis of our key stakeholders, our decisions are more robust. The transparency of the process builds greater confidence by all parties in our processes. There are a few areas in life where anyone can provide certainty, but the confidence that can be built by having predictable processes and transparent evidence-based decision-making is a very good second best. And the staged process allows us to respond to a changing environment. Where appropriate, it allows us to reprioritise projects if and when the evidence base suggests that this is important and appropriate. But importantly, I think Australia doesn't set numerical targets for spectrum allocation for particular use cases into the future. While these are important inputs to our decision-making processes, the medium and long-term forecasts that are often underlie these targets are susceptible to change because of the assumptions that are made and changing circumstances. And locking in targets often risk eliminating the very confidence value that is delivered through careful band planning decision-making by the preemption that those targets involves. And finally, the obvious question is, if you have targets for one particular use case, why not have them for all, with the inevitable escalation of claims that would create? So we feel that having a process that involves transparency, that allows the qualitative and quantitative evidence to be brought forward at appropriate times, has provided us a firm basis for delivering on outcomes that meet the needs of the variety of spectrum users and delivers most effectively on the public interest.
That's brilliant. That certainty is something immeasurable for every operator, and plans are needed to make sure that investments make sense. So that's brilliant. And having that in mind, I'd like to ask Daudeline to let us know that looking into the future and thinking about roadmaps and what's needed next, what would be your requirements for spectrum in the next years to come? And what would you present to regulators and other stakeholders when it comes to it?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to GSMA for inviting me, and it's great to be among a distinguished group of experts in the field. Spectrum is what we do, spectrum is what we know, and spectrum is what we love, so it's great to talk about it. And to follow on what was said before, certainty is definitely something that we enjoy and look forward to and appreciate when it's there. As far as looking into the future, the C-band auction in the US was just completed less than 2 years ago. So we expect the next large tranche of spectrum in about 5 to 7 years from now. And our current thinking on the important attributes for new spectrum are wide bandwidth, such as hundreds of megahertz, good propagation, such as mid-band spectrum, and technical rules that are comparable to existing mid-band spectrum and global alignment. Economies of scale, as we all know, is very important in this field. As for specific bands, 3 gigahertz is something that we're looking at, the lower 3, and spectrum between 7 and 15 gigahertz. And in particular, here in the US, we have utilized the CBRS band, the 3.5 gigahertz band, and there we have been discussing with the FCC allowing higher power usage in that band in order to maximize its use. Thanks.
That's great to hear. And we know that whenever it comes to the United States and spectrum availability, it's a little bit different than other parts of the world. So if that's possible to get the same view from Carol on what your requirements whenever we see a different part of the world, and what would you request? What are the requirements that you have for the future? I brought the same question to you, so a similar question to you, because we know that the United States have a different situation, and Daudeline just talked about this, and we know that Brazil just had the auction. So what are your future requirements as well that you are putting forward to Anatel in that case?
We have two important moves in the last year here in Brazil. One of them was the 5G auction, and also we have another important move that was the acquisition of mobile network access from another Brazilian operator that went into judicial reorganization, which includes spectrum. And I think this is the first time in a long time that Team Brazil and other operators is breathing a sigh of relief, eliminating Team Brazil eliminate historic spectrum gap compared to its competitors that will improve, of course, the customer experience, increase the efficiency of our network, and pave the way for undisputed network leadership. But we know that data traffic will continue to grow in the coming years, so we cannot relax, of course. So that's the reason why Team Brazil will continue to support GSMA in the global spectrum harmonization discussions across all spectrum bands, so low, mid, and high bands. And for Brazilian long-term spectrum needs, for IMT, I think we have certain discussions to make. For low bands, for example, expand the possibilities of using the white spaces, which were enabled by the Brazilian regulator last year, but still under restrictive conditions, so low power, rural areas. So we must discuss how we can use white spaces in other conditions, and think about, for example, in low bands, the GSMA bands refarming, so 850 megahertz and 900 megahertz to allow spectral efficiency, right? And compatibilization of these bands with the new technologies as well, the 5G. For mid bands, I think we here in Brazil, we must discuss the further 8 gigahertz. The 6 gigahertz that earlier this year was allocated completely for the Wi-Fi 6 in Brazil, and we think that we must discuss it again. And also the 10 gigahertz, that one of the bands that will be discussed for Region 2 in the WRC 23. And for millimeter waves, the last Brazilian auction, the 26 gigahertz was unlocked. And now we must understand better how the use cases using this spectrum will evolve in the next years to enable new spectrum ranges for IMT in the millimeter waves. I think that's it.
That's lovely, because whenever we talk about requirements, sometimes we just hear about the amount of spectrum, but there are lots sort of other things around this that you mentioned that are very, very important. And I'll then take this opportunity because you both mentioned mid-bands. Even knowing that both countries have moved forward with those bands and how important it is to expand that part of their range. So then I'll move then to Eric to ask about mid-bands specifically. And then we know throughout the WRC process and publicly, France has been showing interest in expanding the availability of mid-bands. Can you tell us the reason behind it and what's your view on this specific range, Eric, please?
Yes, and thanks for the question. And maybe I need to say first which mid-band we do not want to reallocate for IMT, to be crystal clear. First example is 48, 499, which was part of the slides from Luciana. 48, 499, it's like in the United States or in some other countries in all Europe. That's not available for IMT, and that will remain true for the long term. And the 3842 gigahertz for Europe will be harmonized in 2024 for, say, local vertical needs with low medium power, so something which may looks like CBRS, but of course CBRS is more complex and will not be available for, say, high power macro base stations for MNO. So your questions, what we are speaking about is the upper 6 gigahertz, the 6425 to 7125. And the reason why we think it's important to have use of this frequency band for IMT, for 5G, 6G, is because we are looking forward. We are looking to the potential introductions for 5G. We are looking to what Carola said, which is the need of frequency band in 5-6 years, or it was Daudeline, I'm not too sure. But there will be a need in a few years for having new frequency band, which will enable the soft introductions of new generations. And this frequency band 6425, 7125 is very good for that. It's very good because the services which are using this frequency band, I think they are the same all around the world, Wi-Fi apart, of course. You have fixed service. Fixed service, it's heavily used. In France, we have more than 3,000 fixed links in these frequency bands, which are important, which are used by the operators. But there's always a possibility for this fixing to envisage migrations, which will take some time, which will take 5-6 years also. But there's possibility to have this migration of fixed links, which are, once again, used by the operator. For the fixed satellite service, that's something which is important. We want to have protection of this satellite, but we think, and that's the result of our study, and that's the result of a vast majority of the studies in ITUR, in preparation of WRC 23, it's possible to protect satellite. And not only it's possible, but in addition, this fixed satellite service band has become less important for satellite operator. For most of them, Inmarsat could be slightly apart, for the simple reason that the downlink frequency band of this satellite FSS band correspond to 3438 and 4548. So they are not available in Europe, and they are not available in a lot of part of the world. So the importance of this frequency band for the satellite community is in fact decreasing. So we have a frequency band, 700 megahertz of spectrum, which are possible, feasible, with, we say, a low price, low cost for IMT. And this IMT will be, or this frequency band will be extremely important in 5-6 years in conjunction with the deployment, the initial deployment of 6G. So we think it's extremely important to reserve this frequency band or to envisage this frequency band for 5G and 6G. And my colleagues from Anatel will certainly reject that, but I wish good luck to Carol for having this debate also in Brazil.
No, that's great. That's very good to hear that, because we know that whenever we look into those 2 gigahertz that Luciana presented on mid-bands, it's very hard to get to that need without thinking about 6 gigahertz, especially the upper part. So that's very important, very encouraging whenever it comes to coexistence as well, because those are great points for us to consider. And on the same note, I'd like to ask James a similar question, that is, Australia has made decisions already on expanding the 3.5 gigahertz and decisions on the lower part of the 6 gigahertz, for example. So James, can you tell us about what is behind those decisions? What's the thinking about whenever you were taking that decision? Of course, there's part of your roadmap and the discussions, but what is the reason for that availability and what's next?
Thanks, Luiz, and thank you. You're right. We have made some recent decisions, particularly in relation to 3.5 gigahertz. Australia has planned and allocated spectrum for wireless broadband services, including IMT, in the 3.4 to 3.7 range for much of our landmass. And the most recent auction for that process was completed in 2018. And this has provided an important beachhead for mobile operators to launch 5G services in this country. The band is also used by our national broadband network for the provision of fixed wireless broadband services in regional areas, providing a critical capacity for extending broadband services to places where fibre networks are uneconomic. But since 2020, however, we've also been reviewing the planning for the 3.7 to 4.2 range. This is a frequency range used here by satellite and point-to-point operators, but is relatively lightly used in many areas and, unlike some markets, not used in Australia for direct-to-home television. So driving our review for this band was an assessment that there was a demand for further spectrum allocations for wireless broadband, but also a need to retain capacity for some incumbent use while protecting adjacent band users. And we've also recognised that the business case or use cases for wireless broadbands are expanding, with private or localised networks use cases sitting alongside the clear demand coming from mobile network operators and potential further interest from our national broadband network. And our planning decisions, as always, have sought to balance these needs. So we're moving towards further allocations of spectrum for wireless broadband, which will be established all the way up to 4 gigahertz, providing continued access between 4 and 4.2 gigahertz of 200 megahertz of capacity for satellite and fixed at point-to-point services, and importantly, providing a guard band for adjacent users. Up to 100 megahertz of this additional 300 megahertz of spectrum between 3.7 and 4 will be made available under long-term wide area spectrum licenses in metropolitan and regional areas through auctions. This allocation is most likely to be suited for mobile network operators and expands the amount of spectrum license under this model in the broader C-band to 400 megahertz of spectrum. And then a further additional at least 200 megahertz of spectrum will be made available in metropolitan and regional areas, and up to 600 megahertz of spectrum in remote areas via more flexible licensing, where applicants themselves can define the geographic and spectral range that suits them, and licenses will be available administratively for a set price over shorter terms. We expect that, as we've seen in millimetre wave, this will enable private network operators and smaller regional providers such as wireless internet service providers to make use of this key 5G band. There remain some key decision points to be made as we move forward in the allocation process, including technical frameworks and rules to facilitate different likely requirements of mobile, fixed and private networks on issues such as synchronisation. But we're confident that this mixed licensing model will optimise the opportunities in the marketplace to meet needs of retail and enterprise users. We expect the allocations in remote areas of Australia to start later this year and to complete auctions and the commencement of administrative allocations in metropolitan and regional areas in 2023. In the 6 gigahertz band, we've made some decisions to allocate the lower half of the band for Wi-Fi services, recognising the important increased demand there. But we're taking some time to think further about the appropriate role for the upper part of the 6 gigahertz band, including taking into account the important discussions that will happen at WRC 23 and monitor industry developments more generally. But as always, we will work closely with industry stakeholders before we make any further decisions on that particular band.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to see a different type of approach, as well as the decision to take time whenever it comes to the other to 3.5, and the decision to take time and look into it and look into the higher part of 6 gigahertz. And that's very interesting to see that different approach, and that's very, very good to hear as well. Then I will move then to Mercedes to ask a question about Uruguay specifically being the first 5G available in the region before other countries did even think about it. So what took you to actually make sure that this was possible? And what have you accomplished, and how you've been working on keeping that leadership for the years to come?
Thank you very much, Luiz, for the question. Of course, 5G development faces different challenges. It will depend on the situation of each country and pre-existing spectrum allocation and future ability. For example, in 5G gigahertz band or millimeter wave band. For example, the public company start in 2019 in the millimeter wave band. And we have to consider different challenges that we have to continue follow with the development of the technology. For example, something that we have to consider if we are going to develop non-standalone versus standalone, the potential for the emergence for new providers in the market, as well, for example, the private networks, the adequate availability of equipment, and particularly terminals promptly and affordable costs. Also, the practical existence of business cases. But also, there are other aspects that we have to consider because this is very challenging. And for example, we have to consider that the spectrum under consideration has harmonized and therefore planned and released sufficient in advance, that the licenses are granted for an adequate period, facilitating investment and use cases, that operators have access to a sufficient amount of spectrum quickly and easily, that the cost per use of that spectrum be adequate for the market under consideration, that the competitive procedures for granting license and spectrum are correctly designed, providing security and transparency, attending to the objective. Also, we have to attend that the requirement of the administration for the deployment of networks are incentivized and not obstacles. And also, we have to promote a genuine competition, facilitating the deployment of infrastructure. But if I have to say the main three aspects to work on, I think that the first one is to attend user experience and connectivity rather than stop just at the mere of radio coverage. Secondly, that the digital transformation has to attend and consider all the society. And thirdly, that promote investment and an adequate regulatory framework is essential to incentivize the development of new technologies. Nowadays, we are working on the next spectrum auction for 3.5 gigahertz, but also in some part of millimeters. We schedule it for the year second half, but we know that if we want to universalize and develop new affordable and service promoting social and economic growth, the companies need a spectrum. So also in our country, we are working to be a hub of innovation and a place suitable for developing of technology. And for this also 5G technology is very important. And we are working hard to ensure that everyone has access to radio communication services in line with the technology deployed. It doesn't matter if it is in 4G or 5G, but we are focused on make available for everyone to have a good connection. And we think that it's not only a question of radio coverage, but also of the quality of services. And in this context, operators need adequate and timely access to the spectrum resources in the low, medium, and high band also. It's essential for the regulator to participate actively, working collaboratively with the ecosystem as a whole, contributing through adequate regulations to protect consumers and society, and promoting investment and technology upgrading, enabling the deployment of infrastructure and its sharing also, both active and passive resources, in favor of the most effective and efficient use of the spectrum. Reasonably, another aspect is to, of course, accompany prospective studies of the radio spectrum and actively participate in regulatory decisions that potentially have a global or regional impact that help us to take better decisions. Thank you.
No, that's perfect because you touched on the leadership based on not just the amount of spectrum being made available, the future that you're thinking about, but also how you see the quality of service being very important as a result of that. So it's very interesting. And I'll take the opportunity to continue a question to you. If there's any plan in Uruguay for the availability of 600 megahertz?
The truth is that we are analyzing the topic. We are listening to different positions. We know that now it's a trending topic and every country analyzing and working on it. But at this moment, we are not in a hurry and we are continuing to analyze the topic and of course, attending what's going on in the region.
Perfect. No, thank you very much for clarifying. Thank you very much, Geraldo, for your question. And you, of course, you started in millimeter waves and you're making more millimeter waves available soon. So I'd like to ask Daudeline, that is one of the great examples of millimeter wave success around the world in Verizon. Can you talk a little bit about millimeter wave and how it's been playing an important role and what have been the developments in millimeter wave for you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Millimeter wave is a vital component of Verizon's 5G strategy. As we all know, these frequencies can carry massive amounts of data at very high speeds and with very little latency. That makes them ideal for accommodating massive increase in data demands for mobile users, connected homes, AR/VR devices, cloud gaming systems, self-driving vehicles, just to name a few. The recent addition of C-band into our portfolio has not changed or slowed down our millimeter wave plans at all. And unlike C-band, where there is an existing macro grid infrastructure that serves initial deployments, millimeter wave is a different story. We need to build. And throughout the pandemic over the past few years, Verizon has continued to build millimeter wave 5G sites at a steady clip. That means zoning, working with local regulators, laying fiber, getting access to light poles and other infrastructure, and of course, deploying the equipment. Overall, 5G operating on millimeter wave is expected to improve user experience, power new use cases, as I mentioned before, such as industrial automation and IoT, smart cities, and those responsible for infrastructure management are expecting to rely on 5G's capacity to handle all of the devices that require large amounts of data in short periods of time. And the goal is to ensure that those devices can work reliably and, of course, securely in high density areas. We've found that millimeter wave spectrum is important in dense traffic areas where customers have high demand for data intensive services. Examples include stadiums, factories, airports, and dense urban areas. For example, Verizon has deployed millimeter wave in over 60 stadiums and arenas and over 15 airports across the US. The additional bandwidth and capacity with millimeter wave enables us to give our customers a great experience in these locations. For example, in the stadium use case, broadcasters, teams, and fans could use sensor-based technology to quickly and accurately collect and share game statistics, which provide near real-time in-game analysis, something sports fans really enjoy doing. And airport travelers, as we all know, have high demand for data, including video streaming and downloads. I was just in Chicago last weekend. Right before my flight took off, I was downloading a few episodes of my favorite show just to make sure I was entertained during the flight. And I'm sure we've all been in that situation. In addition, airport vendors and airports themselves rely on high-speed coverage for machine-to-machine and airport enterprise operations. We also expect millimeter wave to make its way into some small suburban towns where there are places such as a town center that could benefit from added capacity and high bandwidth. Eventually, we expect millimeter wave to carry 50% of urban traffic. And as I said at the outset, millimeter wave is an important part of Verizon's 5G strategy, where low, mid, and high band spectrum are being leveraged to provide our customers an unparalleled experience. Thanks.
Oh, that's brilliant to hear how much this brought to not just the development of 5G in different ways and use cases, but also to the user whenever it comes to those specific areas. So that's brilliant. We don't have much time anymore, but I'd like to ask a final question to Eric before we finish. It's about WRC coming up. So what do you think the WRC coming up success would be? And what happens next? After this one is done, what should we think next?
Well, thanks for the question, and it's difficult to predict what will be the outcome of WRC. I think for the items which are for this WRC 23 to decide, so the additional IMT frequency band, I certainly hope from my side that the upper executives will be identified. That will be for region 1, but obviously it means that there will be an ecosystem in this frequency band. We know that some countries outside region 1 are already willing to use this frequency band, so certainly that can create this new ecosystem which is needed in this upper 6 gigahertz. I have certainly less expectation for the UHF frequency band once again for region 1, and then I think your question is also more about the future, which means whether we would have for WRC 27 an agenda item, and that will be decided by WRC 23, about some additional frequency band to enable the introduction of 6G in the years 2030. So obviously there's some elements on the sub-terahertz spectrum for sure, but that's also raising the issue of the mid bands, the critical one, in particular for the region one. If the upper 6 gigahertz cannot be identified for IMT, we know that the other mid bands will become very critical, and that's also one of the reasons why I'm say pushing for the upper 6 gigahertz as a nice solutions already available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's of course it's more than what we are seeing today in this conversation is what the future holds, but that will be for us to talk next time. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for being here today with us and for all the amazing information you brought to us to complement the reports and the research that we've done. And I'd like to thank everybody that is here and then everybody in the audience as well for their presence. And thank you very much. Have a lovely day, end of day, or morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much.